The hammer felt like an extension of Nathaniel Brooks's own ragged pulse, each strike against the iron nail a punctuation mark in a silent, desperate prayer. Dust, fine as ground bone, swirled around him, whipped into a frenzy by a wind that had screamed across the Arizona desert for 3 straight days. It coated his tongue, gritted in his teeth, and stung his eyes. But Nathaniel didn't stop. He was securing the cross to the steeple of a church that had no right to exist, in a place God himself seemed to have forgotten. The half-built structure was a skeleton of sun-bleached timber rising from the cracked earth, a testament to a faith worn down to its studs. He had built it alone, board by painstaking board, his penance measured in splinters and sweat. This was his exile. Boston, with its cobblestone streets and self-righteous sermons, was a lifetime away, a world of whispers and accusations that had chased him into this unforgiving wilderness. He had been a preacher there, a man whose words could fill a cathedral. Now, his only congregation was the saguaro cacti, their silent arms raised in a perpetual, mocking supplication. He drove the final nail home, the sharp ring lost in the wind's howl. Leaning his forehead against the rough-hewn wood of the cross, Nathaniel closed his eyes. The face of Silas Croft materialized behind his lids, stern, powerful, his voice dripping with sanctimonious fury as he stood before the Boston Presbytery. "A shepherd who preys upon his flock is no shepherd at all," Croft had declared, his words sealing Nathaniel's fate. The scandal had been a lie, a masterfully woven tapestry of deceit, but in the face of Croft's influence, truth had been a fragile, weightless thing. A flicker of movement at the edge of the dust storm pulled him from the memory. Nathaniel squinted, his hand shielding his eyes against the stinging grit. A figure, dark and wavering in the ochre haze, was stumbling toward the church. It was a mirage, he thought at first, another trick of the heat in his own isolation. But the shape grew more distinct, resolving into the form of a person battling the wind, a traveler on the verge of collapse. He descended the rickety ladder, his boots sinking into the soft sand as he moved to intercept the stranger. As he drew closer, he saw it was a woman, her slight frame wrapped in a dark, travel-stained cloak. A heavy veil obscured her face, a strange affectation in this desolate land where the only judgments came from the sun and the silence. She was listing badly, each step a monumental effort. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Are you lost?" She didn't seem to hear him, her focus fixed on the skeletal church as if it were a lighthouse in a storm. She took 2 more faltering steps and then her knees buckled. Nathaniel surged forward, catching her just before she hit the ground. Her body was shockingly light in his arms, her breathing shallow and ragged. He lifted her easily and carried her toward the one finished part of his church, a small vestry at the back that served as his living quarters. He laid her on his simple cot, the coarse wool of her cloak scratching against his worn blanket. Her head lolled to the side, the veil still hiding her features. He hesitated for a moment, his hands hovering over the fabric. It felt like an intrusion to remove it, yet he needed to see if she was injured, to give her water. With a quiet apology, he reached for the pins holding the veil in place. As he gently lifted the dusty fabric, his breath caught in his throat. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps in her late 20s, with a face pale from exhaustion but possessing a delicate, almost ethereal beauty. Her dark hair was matted with dust, and a faint, crescent-shaped scar marked her left temple. Her lips, chapped and dry, parted as she let out a faint, shuddering breath. Nathaniel fetched water from the barrel in the corner, his hands, usually so steady, trembling slightly. He dipped a clean cloth into the bucket and gently moistened her lips. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He supported her head, helping her take a few sips of water. She swallowed weakly, a soft sigh escaping her. He sat on the stool beside the cot, watching her, a maelstrom of questions swirling in his mind. Who was she? What was she doing in the middle of the desert, miles from any town or settlement? And why had she been heading for his unfinished church with such desperate purpose? The wind rattled the loose boards of the vestry, a lonely counterpoint to the woman's shallow breathing. For hours, he kept vigil as the storm raged outside. He cleaned the dust from her face, noting the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. There was a fragility about her, but also an undercurrent of strength in the set of her jaw. This was a woman who had endured, who had fought to get here. As dusk began to bleed through the cracks in the walls, her eyes finally flickered open. They were a startling shade of violet, clouded with confusion as they took in the unfamiliar surroundings. The rough timber walls, the single flickering lantern, the strange man watching over her. "Where?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You're safe," Nathaniel said softly. "You collapsed in the storm. I brought you inside." Her gaze moved from his face to the small, unadorned cross he had hung on the wall above his cot. Recognition, or something like it, dawned in her eyes. She struggled to sit up, a flicker of panic animating her features. "Easy now," he cautioned, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're weak from your journey." She ignored him, pushing herself up on one elbow, her violet eyes locking onto his. "Forgive me, Father," she breathed, the words tumbling out on a wave of desperation. "Forgive me for my sin." Her eyes held a feverish intensity, a look of profound, soul-deep guilt. She clutched at the collar of her dress, her knuckles white. "And for yours," the words struck Nathaniel with the force of a physical blow. "And for yours." He felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be. The scandal in Boston had been built on whispers and lies, its architects a world away. There was no one here who knew his story, no one who could possibly know the sin he was accused of. Before he could speak, before he could demand an explanation for her impossible words, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed back onto the cot, her body limp with exhaustion. She had fainted, leaving her cryptic confession hanging in the air between them, a poison dart that had found its mark across 1,000 miles of wilderness. Nathaniel stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. This woman was no random traveler lost in the storm. Her arrival was a message, a specter from the past he thought he had buried. As he looked at her still form, he noticed something he had missed before. A thin, silver chain around her neck, tucked beneath the collar of her dress. With trembling fingers, he gently drew it out. A small, intricately carved silver locket rested in his palm. It was shaped like a dove, its wings slightly open as if in mid-flight. He had seen a locket like this once before, in a different time, a different life. His hand shook as he worked the tiny clasp. It sprang open, revealing 2 miniature portraits. On one side was the familiar, hate-filled face of Silas Croft. On the other was a portrait of a beautiful young woman with violet eyes and a radiant smile, a woman whose testimony had been the final nail in the coffin of his reputation. It was Silas Croft's daughter, Eleanor, and the veiled stranger lying on his cot was her. The silver locket felt cold as a tombstone in Nathaniel's hand. Outside, the storm shrieked, pressing against the thin timber walls of the vestry as if trying to reclaim the woman he had dragged from its maw. Eleanor Croft. The name was a brand on his memory, a symbol of the life that had been stolen from him. Her face, captured in the miniature portrait, was younger, untouched by the hardship now etched upon her sleeping features. It was the face of a witness. The final, damning voice that had echoed her father's lies and sent him spiraling into this desolate exile. A bitter, corrosive anger surged through him. He wanted to drop the locket, to wake her, to demand an accounting for the ruins of his life. He wanted to carry her back out into the teeth of the gale and leave her to the judgment of the desert. It would be justice, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. He had come here to build a church, a monument to a faith he barely recognized anymore. But the God of this wilderness was a God of harsh, simple truths. Survival, retribution. But as he looked down at her, at the shallow, feverish rise and fall of her chest, another instinct warred with his rage. It was the shepherd's instinct, the vow he had taken to minister to the lost, the broken, the suffering. It was a vow he had failed to live up to in Boston, not through sin but through weakness, and it had haunted him every day since. To abandon her now would be to fail again, to prove Silas Croft right. It would make this church, his grueling penance, a hollow mockery. His fingers, stiff with cold and fury, closed around the locket. He tucked it back beneath the collar of her dress, the cool metal a stark contrast to the heat radiating from her skin. She was burning with fever. The journey, the collapse, the storm, it had all taken its toll. As if sensing his touch, her eyelids fluttered open again. The violet irises were unnervingly bright, swimming with feverish delirium, yet they found his face and held it. The locket, she whispered, her voice a dry, cracked thing. I know, Nathaniel confirmed, his voice flat and hard. I know you are Eleanor Croft. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. I had to come, she rasped, struggling to prop herself up on an elbow. I couldn't live with the silence anymore. What silence? He demanded, the question sharper than he intended. The silence of your conscience? You spoke quite clearly at the hearing, Miss Croft. Your words were most effective. She flinched as if he had struck her. I was a child, she breathed, a fit of coughing racking her small frame. My father, he told me what to say. He said you were a wicked man, that you had wronged me. The last words were barely audible, lost in another ragged cough. Nathaniel stood, moving to the water barrel. He couldn't listen to this, not now. He needed distance. He refilled the cup and brought it back to her, his movements stiff and deliberate. Drink, he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He supported her head as she took a few sips, the water seeming to momentarily clear her thoughts. Her eyes, blazing with fever, fixed on him again. He is a monster, Nathaniel, she whispered, using his given name with a familiarity that grated on his soul. He twisted truth into a weapon. I saw it then, but I was too afraid. Now I cannot be afraid any longer. She clutched his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. He wants to marry me to a man I despise, a business partner, another soul he can crush. I ran. I took what little I had and I ran. Her story, a desperate flight from a tyrannical father, should have stirred his compassion. But all Nathaniel could hear were the echoes of his own ruin. Why here? He asked, his voice cold. Of all the places in this godforsaken country, why did you come to me? Because the sin, it was not yours alone, she gasped, her strength failing. It was mine, too. I lied. And that lie, it has been a poison in my soul for 5 years. I came for absolution. Her confession was a ragged, broken thing, a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But before he could demand more, her eyes lost their focus. Her body went limp, and she slumped back against the cot, her breath coming in short, shallow pants. He touched her forehead again. The heat was more intense now, a dangerous, consuming fire. He was no doctor, but he had seen enough sickness in the slums of Boston and enough death on his journey west to recognize a body at war with itself. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and in the grip of a powerful fever. Without care, she would not see the morning. He stood over her, the conflict tearing him apart. She was the daughter of his nemesis, a living embodiment of his disgrace. Yet, she was also a soul in torment, a sick and desperate woman who had appeared on his doorstep seeking sanctuary. He looked around the small, unfinished vestry. This wasn't just his home. It was a house of God, however humble. And the first lesson he had ever learned, the lesson at the very core of his shattered faith, was to offer shelter to the storm-tossed. With a heavy sigh that felt like a surrender, Nathaniel turned away from her and went to the small chest where he kept his few worldly possessions. From the bottom, he pulled a leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. It had been his father's, a physician in a small New England town. It was a medical text, filled with anatomical drawings and detailed descriptions of treatments for ailments ranging from consumption to fever. He had kept it as a memento, never imagining he would need its wisdom. He lit another lantern, the small room filling with a brighter, warmer light. He found the chapter on fevers and began to read, his mind shifting from the anger of the accused to the focus of the caregiver. He needed to bring her temperature down, to get fluids into her. He went back outside, braving the still howling wind to gather handfuls of snow from a clean drift against the church wall. Back inside, he wrapped the snow in a spare piece of linen and gently placed the compress on her forehead. She moaned softly but did not wake. He spent the rest of the night in a quiet, desperate battle for her life. He brewed a tea from the willow bark he kept for his own aches and pains, a remedy his father's book confirmed could reduce fever. He spent what felt like an hour trying to get a few spoonfuls of the bitter liquid past her lips. He bathed her face and wrists with cool water, watching for any sign of change. Sometime before dawn, as the wind began to lose its fury, he noticed her breathing deepen, becoming more regular. The violent shivering that had seized her body had subsided into a less alarming tremor. He placed his hand on her forehead. The skin was still hot, but the raging fire seemed to have banked slightly. She was not out of danger, not by a long shot, but she was holding on. Exhausted, Nathaniel sank onto the stool, his head in his hands. He had made his choice. He had chosen grace over vengeance, duty over bitterness. As the first pale, gray light of a new day filtered through the cracks in the walls, he looked at the sleeping woman, her face now peaceful in the dim light. Saving her life would not restore his own, but perhaps, in the crucible of this shared crisis, he might find something he had lost long ago, a purpose beyond his own pain. He had set out to build a church of wood and nails, but now he understood. His true test, his real chance at redemption, was lying on the cot before him. And as the desert world outside quieted, he offered his first genuine prayer in years, a simple, desperate plea for the life of Eleanor Croft. The desert morning broke in hushed, crystalline clarity. The storm had scoured the air clean, and the rising sun ignited the rain-darkened reds and purples of the distant mesas. It was a world washed new, a fragile baptism. Inside the vestry, the quiet was just as profound. The fever had broken in the last hours before dawn, leaving Eleanor Croft pale and impossibly fragile, but breathing with the deep, even rhythm of true sleep. Nathaniel stood by the open doorway, a tin cup of bitter coffee warming his hands, his body humming with an exhaustion that went bone deep. He had not slept. He had watched, listened, and fought a silent war against the fever. And in the stillness of the morning, he felt not triumph, but a vast and unsettling emptiness. He had saved her. Now, he was trapped with her. He moved about his morning chores with a rigid, deliberate slowness. He fed his mule, checked the water barrel, now thankfully replenished by the storm, and inspected the church for damage. A few loose boards on the roof and a scattering of debris were the only scars left by the wind's fury. The cross he had mounted just yesterday remained steadfast against the brilliant blue sky. A symbol of what? Endurance? Folly? He no longer knew. When he returned to the vestry, Eleanor was awake. She was propped against the wall on his cot, the rough blanket pulled up to her chin. The fever had receded from her eyes, leaving them a soft, shadowed violet, filled with a weariness that mirrored his own. Her gaze followed him as he stoked the fire and put a small pot of cornmeal mush on to cook. "Thank you," she said, her voice weak but clear. Nathaniel didn't turn. "For what?" "For not leaving me in the storm. It would have been an unchristian act," he replied, the words stiff and formal. He could feel her watching him, could feel the weight of her unspoken questions. "The mush will be ready soon," he said, breaking the silence. "You need to eat." He brought her a bowl, and she took it with hands that trembled slightly. She ate slowly, each spoonful a visible effort. Nathaniel sat on his stool across the small room, cleaning his tools, the scrape of the whetstone against steel a sharp, abrasive sound that filled the space between them. "My father's partner," she said suddenly, setting the half-empty bowl aside. "The man he wants me to marry. His name is Marcus Thorne." Nathaniel continued sharpening his knife, his knuckles white. "I have no interest in your Boston affairs, Miss Croft." "You should," she insisted, a flicker of her earlier fire returning. "Because he is the reason I ran. He and my father, they are not just businessmen, preacher. They are predators. They ruin men for sport, acquire their properties through deception. They were celebrating the financial collapse of a family whose shipping business they had sabotaged. They laughed. Her voice broke, thick with disgust. I heard them. They spoke of the man's ruin as a victory, a testament to their own cleverness." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "That was the final silence I could not endure. My silence, my complicity. I took what jewelry my mother had left me, sold it in the next town, and used the money to come west. And you chose to run toward the man your family had already ruined," Nathaniel stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "An interesting choice." "The only choice," she whispered. "The guilt, it led me here. I read the newspaper accounts. I knew you had come west to build a church for the lost. I thought if anyone could understand the need for redemption, it would be you." He finally set the knife down, the sharpened blade gleaming in the morning light. He stood and walked to the doorway, his back to her. The vast, empty landscape offered no answers. "Redemption is a concept for men who still believe they have a soul to save, Miss Croft. Mine was auctioned off in a Boston courthouse 5 years ago. Your father held the gavel. He felt, more than heard, her quiet intake of breath. He was being cruel, he knew, twisting the knife of her guilt. But the wound she and her father had inflicted was still raw, and her presence was a constant, agonizing pressure on it. He spent the rest of the day working on the church, needing the physical labor to quell the storm inside him. He hammered roof boards into place with a ferocity that bordered on rage, each blow a strike against the past, against Silas Croft, against the frail woman watching him from the doorway of the vestry. Eleanor did not stay idle. Though she was still weak, she moved about the small room, tidying his meager belongings, folding his blankets with a neatness that shamed his own haphazard methods. She found a bucket and, with slow, careful movements, began to scrub the dusty floor. "You should be resting," he said gruffly, descending the ladder for more nails. "I cannot be a burden," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I have caused you enough trouble." And so they existed for 2 days in a fragile, unspoken truce, orbiting each other in the silent space of the church and vestry. They shared meals without conversation, the clink of spoons against bowls the only communication. But in the quiet moments, Nathaniel found himself watching her. He saw the way she limped slightly when she thought he wasn't looking, a testament to the harshness of her journey. He saw the way her hands, though uncalloused, moved with a quiet competence. He saw the profound sadness that settled in her eyes when she stared out at the endless desert. On the third morning, Nathaniel rose before dawn, a deep disquiet settling over him. Something was wrong. It was a feeling he'd learned to trust, a subtle shift in the air, a tension in the silence. He dressed quickly and stepped outside. The air was still and cool. He checked on the mule, which was grazing peacefully. He walked the perimeter of the church, his eyes scanning the ground, softened by the recent rain. And then he saw it. Near the collection of rocks where the trail from the east disappeared, there was a single, deep hoof print. It was not his mule's. The shoe was newer, the shape cleaner. The storm had washed away most tracks, but this one, protected by a rocky overhang, was clear. Someone had been here, and recently. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He followed the faint trail for a few yards until it vanished on harder ground. As he turned back, his gaze swept the horizon. Nothing, just the vast, empty expanse of the desert. But as he looked closer, a glint of metal caught his eye, half buried in the damp sand near a creosote bush. He knelt, brushing the sand away. It was a spent cartridge casing, brass and sleek. He picked it up. It was from a Sharps rifle, a newer model, a long-range weapon favored by buffalo hunters and bounty men. His blood ran cold. He stood, the casing clutched in his palm, and scanned the maces again, this time with the eyes of a hunted man. He saw nothing, but he felt it. A presence, a watcher. Silas Croft was a man who did not tolerate loose ends. He would not have let his daughter, the keeper of his dangerous secrets, simply disappear. He would have sent someone after her. Nathaniel returned to the vestry, his movements now quiet and purposeful. He did not tell Eleanor what he had found. It would only add to her fear, and she needed to regain her strength. But the knowledge of the Watcher changed everything. Their fragile truce was no longer just a matter of managing the past. It was now a desperate fight for a future. Any future at all. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, Nathaniel climbed the ladder to the half-finished steeple. He told Eleanor he was going to secure a loose beam before nightfall, a plausible lie. From that vantage point, he had a clear view of the surrounding desert for miles. He scanned the landscape, his eyes tracing the long shadows that stretched from the saguaros and the rock formations. The world was sinking into the deep blue of twilight. For a long time, he saw nothing but the natural, lonely beauty of the desert at dusk. He was about to descend, to dismiss the hoofprint and the casing as remnants of a passing traveler, when he saw it. Far to the southeast, nestled in a hidden arroyo about 3 miles distant, a tiny pinprick of light flickered to life. A campfire. It was small, carefully banked to avoid drawing attention, but in the deepening darkness, it was as clear as a confession. They were not alone. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. The bounty hunter from the description, the man sent by her father, was no longer a phantom fear. He was real, and he was close. Nathaniel remained motionless in the steeple, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky, the hammer in his hand suddenly feeling as useless as a prayer against the coming darkness. The fragile sanctuary he had built was about to become a siege ground. The campfire was a malevolent star fallen to earth. From his perch in the steeple, Nathaniel watched it burn, a tiny speck of orange in an ocean of encroaching darkness, and felt the last of his self-pity turn to ash. The ghosts of Boston were gone, exorcised by a threat that was immediate, physical, and hunting them. Silas Croft hadn't just banished him. He had, in his own cruel way, sent a messenger to remind Nathaniel that the past was never truly buried. He descended the ladder, his movements measured and silent. The hammer in his hand felt absurdly heavy, a tool for creation in a world that now demanded evasion. He looked at the faint light spilling from the vestry door. Inside was Eleanor Croft, a woman whose name was a curse, a woman whose testimony had been a lie, and a woman who was now his sole responsibility. The irony was a bitter pill. He, the disgraced shepherd, was all that stood between this lost sheep and the wolf her own father had sent. He entered the small room without a word. Eleanor was sitting on the edge of the cot, mending a tear in her cloak with a needle and thread from his small kit. She looked up, her violet eyes questioning his grim expression. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low and devoid of preamble. He placed the spent cartridge casing on the small table between them. "I found this morning. There's a campfire in an arroyo, about 3 miles southeast. We're being watched." He expected fear, perhaps tears or a desperate plea for reassurance. Instead, a profound and terrible stillness settled over Eleanor's features. Her hands went still in her lap, the needle forgotten, her gaze fixed on the brass casing as if it were a venomous snake. "A Sharp's rifle?" she stated, her voice a flat, dead thing. It was not a question. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because my father has a preferred instrument for his particular brand of business," she said, her eyes lifting to meet his. The weariness in them had been replaced by a chilling certainty. "The man he sent is named Jedediah Kane. He favors a Sharp's for its range and its power. He says it leaves little room for argument." The name meant nothing to Nathaniel, but the way she spoke it sent a shiver down his spine. "A bounty hunter?" "Worse," she whispered, her hands twisting the fabric of her cloak. "He's a man who finds joy in his work. He doesn't just track people, preacher. He breaks them. My father uses him when he wants to send a message, when he wants to ensure a lesson is thoroughly learned." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a simple retrieval. It was a punishment, a message to a disobedient daughter, and, perhaps, a final, cruel twist of the knife for the preacher who had dared to defy him. Nathaniel's mind, which had felt sluggish with grief and anger for 5 years, suddenly sharpened to a razor's edge. The years of solitary survival, of reading the landscape, of learning the hard lessons of the desert, now coalesced into a single, desperate imperative. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice now crisp with authority. He began to move about the small room, his actions swift and purposeful. "This church, it's a beacon in this flat land. It offers no cover, no defense. It's a trap." Eleanor watched him, her initial shock giving way to a flicker of hope. "What are we going to do?" "We run," he said simply. He pulled his sturdiest waterskin from a peg on the wall. "We leave tonight, under the cover of darkness. We'll head north, toward the Superstition Mountains. The terrain is rougher there. There are old mining trails, canyons, caves, places a man on foot can go that a man on horseback will miss. It's our only chance." The plan was a wild gamble, a flight into a wilderness known for swallowing men whole. But it was better than waiting here to be cornered. "I will not slow you down," Eleanor said, a fierce resolve hardening her voice. She stood, swaying slightly, but her jaw was set. "Tell me what to do." For the next hour, the vestry became a hive of frantic, whispered activity. The invisible wall that had stood between them dissolved in the face of their shared purpose. He directed, and she obeyed, her movements becoming surer as her strength returned. He had her fill every canteen and waterskin they possessed while he gathered what little food he had, a half sack of cornmeal, some dried jerky, a handful of parched beans. It was pitifully little for a journey into the mountains, but it would have to be enough. He rummaged through the chest and pulled out his father's medical kit. Bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid, a few surgical tools. He checked them with a practiced eye, the muscle memory of his past life serving the desperate needs of his present. "Take this," he said, handing her his warmest blanket. "Roll it as tight as you can." They moved around the small space, their orbits constantly intersecting. As he reached for a coil of rope, his hand brushed against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. Her skin was cool, her touch surprisingly firm. In that fleeting moment, she was not Eleanor Croft, daughter of his enemy. She was simply a woman, alive and vulnerable, whose fate was now inextricably bound to his. He saw her stumble as she tried to lift a heavy water skin, her face paling with the effort. He was at her side in an instant, his hand closing over her arm to steady her. "Easy," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You've been through a fever. You need to be strong enough for this journey." She looked up at him, her violet eyes dark in the lantern light. He was standing closer to her than he ever had before. He could see the faint scar at her temple, the determined set of her mouth. "I have no other choice," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "And neither do you." He held her gaze for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The animosity, the bitterness, the weight of the past, it all receded, eclipsed by the terrifying, unifying reality of their situation. He was no longer a preacher, and she was no longer a witness. They were survivors. He finished packing their meager supplies into 2 bundles, one for him, one for the mule. He looked around the vestry one last time. It wasn't much, but it had been his sanctuary, the place where he had tried to piece together his shattered faith. He looked at the half-finished church outside, the steeple a dark finger pointing toward a heaven that felt very far away. He had come here to build a house for God, and now he was abandoning it to save a woman from a devil of her father's making. "It's time," he said. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light a pale, silver wash from the sliver of moon filtering through the window. He handed Eleanor a canteen. "Stay close behind me," he instructed, his voice a low command. "And do not make a sound. Cain will be listening for it." He unbarred the door and peered out into the desert night. The landscape was a ghostly tableau of silver and black, beautiful and lethal. The air was cold and clean. He took one last look back at the dark, silent interior of his church, a failed penance, a broken dream. Then, with Eleanor a shadow at his back, he stepped out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Somewhere out in that silent, moon-drenched darkness, a man with a sharp's rifle was watching, waiting, and Nathaniel Brooks, the exiled preacher, was leading the daughter of his enemy right into the heart of it. The desert at night was a different world, a kingdom of shadows and whispers. Every rustle of a creosote bush, every skitter of a nocturnal creature, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Nathaniel's veins. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his senses honed by years of solitude, every nerve ending alive to the vast, predatory silence of the wilderness. Eleanor followed a few paces behind, her small form a dark, determined shadow against the silvered sand. He had been surprised by her resilience. She moved with a quiet, dogged endurance, her limp barely noticeable, her breathing controlled despite the arduous terrain. They kept to the low ground, using the washes and arroyos carved by ancient floods as their highway, their path dictated by the need for cover. The Superstition Mountains loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the star-dusted canopy of the sky. They were their destination, their only hope for sanctuary, but they were still a day's hard journey away. Nathaniel led his mule, a gentle, sure-footed creature named Patience, by a short rope. The animal's pack, containing most of their water and supplies, shifted with a soft, rhythmic creak that seemed deafening in the stillness. After what felt like hours, he called a halt in the deep shadow of a rock outcropping. He gestured for Eleanor to sit, and she sank to the ground, her relief palpable. He offered her a strip of jerky, and she took it with a grateful nod. They ate in silence, their backs pressed against the cool stone, their eyes scanning the dark, empty landscape. "How did you learn to move like this?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely disturbing the quiet. "Like you're a part of the shadows. The desert is a harsh teacher," Nathaniel replied, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "It teaches you to be quiet, to be patient, or it kills you." He took a sip of water from his canteen, the liquid cool and precious. "Cain will be tracking us by morning. As soon as the sun is up, he'll find our trail." Then why are we stopping? Because we need to rest, he said, looking at her with a new, assessing gaze. And because we need to leave him a message. He stood and, with a few quick, practiced movements, began to build a small fire in a shallow depression in the sand, using the driest pieces of greasewood he could find. A fire? Eleanor asked, her voice sharp with alarm. But you said, he'll see it. That's the point, Nathaniel said, his face illuminated by the first flickering flames. He took a spare blanket from the mule's pack and arranged it near the fire, along with a half-empty canteen and a few pieces of jerky scattered carelessly on the ground. He'll find this camp. He'll see the single blanket, the spilled water. He'll think we're amateurs, panicked and careless. He'll think we're still here, or close by, and he'll waste time searching this area. Eleanor stared at the false campsite, a dawning understanding in her eyes. A decoy, a small one, Nathaniel admitted. But it might buy us an hour. And an hour in these mountains can be the difference between life and death. He looked at her, the firelight dancing in her violet eyes. We leave in 10 minutes. Rest while you can, she nodded, her expression a mixture of fear and a grudging respect. He was no longer just the disgraced preacher, the angry, wounded man she had found in the desert. He was a survivor, a strategist, a man whose quiet competence was as formidable as the wilderness itself. They set off again, leaving the small fire burning behind them like a false promise. This time, their path was more difficult. Nathaniel led them over rocky ground, deliberately choosing a route that would be harder to track. The land began to slope upward, the first foothills of the mountains rising around them like the bones of sleeping giants. Sometime in the hours before dawn, Eleanor stumbled, a sharp cry of pain escaping her lips. Nathaniel was at her side in an instant, his hand on her arm to steady her. "What is it?" he whispered. "My ankle," she gasped, leaning heavily against him. I twisted it on a loose rock. He knelt, his fingers gently probing the leather of her worn boot. He could feel the swelling already beginning. It wasn't broken, but it was a serious sprain. He looked up at her, his face grim in the pale, pre-dawn light. "Could you walk on it?" "I have to," she said, her voice tight with pain. He stood and, without a word, tore a long strip from the bottom of his own shirt. He knelt again and, after she had managed to remove her boot, began to bind her ankle, his hands moving with the sure, gentle touch of a man who knew how to mend broken things. The wrap was tight and professional, providing support and stability. "Thank you," she said softly as he helped her put her boot back on. "It will slow us down," he stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. "I know," she replied, her voice filled with a frustration that was directed at herself. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Just be strong." He helped her to her feet, and she tested the ankle, wincing as she put weight on it. It was painful, but she could stand. He took one of the bundles from the mule and added it to his own pack, lightening the animal's load. Then he looped the mule's lead rope around her hand. "Lean on patience," he instructed. "Let her take some of your weight." They continued their climb, their pace now agonizingly slow. The sun began to rise, a great, bloody orb on the eastern horizon, and with it came the certainty that Jedediah Cain would be on their trail. The false campsite might have bought them time, but it would not fool him for long. The landscape grew more rugged, the path steeper. They were in the heart of the foothills now, a maze of canyons and rock-strewn slopes. Nathaniel's eyes constantly scanned the terrain, looking for a place to hide, a defensible position where they could rest and reassess. It was Eleanor who spotted it first. "Look," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper, pointing toward a sheer rock face a few hundred yards to their right. "Up there?" Nathaniel followed her gaze. High up on the cliff, almost invisible against the shadowed rock, was a dark slit. It looked like the entrance to a cave or an old mine shaft. It was difficult to reach, requiring a steep, treacherous climb up a narrow, scree-covered ledge. But it was also nearly impossible to see from below. It was a perfect hiding place. "Can you make it?" he asked, looking at her pale, pain-lined face. She didn't answer with words. She simply tightened her grip on the mule's lead rope and began to move toward the cliff, her jaw set with a determination that took his breath away. The climb was a nightmare. The ledge was barely wide enough for the mule, and loose rocks constantly shifted under their feet, threatening to send them tumbling into the canyon below. Nathaniel went first, testing each foothold, his hand outstretched to help Eleanor. She followed without complaint, her face slick with sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but her eyes never wavered from their goal. They reached the cave entrance just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, flooding the desert with a harsh, unforgiving light. The cave was shallow, more of a deep overhang than a true cavern, but it was large enough for the three of them and offered a commanding view of the canyon below. Most importantly, it was hidden from sight. Exhausted, they collapsed onto the dusty floor of the cave. Nathaniel immediately moved to the entrance, peering cautiously over the edge. From this vantage point, he could see the trail they had taken, a faint, winding scar across the desert floor. He watched for what felt like an eternity. The desert was still and silent. And then, he saw him. A lone rider, a dark speck moving with relentless purpose along their trail. Even at this distance, Nathaniel could see the glint of the sun on the long barrel of the rifle cradled in the man's arms. Jedediah Cain had found them. Nathaniel pulled back from the edge, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He looked at Eleanor, who had dragged herself to the entrance to see for herself. Her face was ashen, but her eyes were steady. "He's good," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The decoy didn't hold him for long. Nathaniel didn't reply. He was looking at the rifle he had carried with him from his church, a simple, single-shot Springfield, a relic from the war. It was a farmer's gun, meant for hunting rabbits, not for fighting a man like Cain. He checked his ammunition. He had 10 rounds, 10 chances. He looked at Eleanor, at her bound ankle, at the exhaustion that radiated from her in waves. They could run no further. This was where they would make their stand. "Get back from the entrance," he said, his voice a low, hard command, "and stay down." He settled himself into a position behind a rocky outcrop near the mouth of the cave, the Springfield resting on the stone before him. He was a preacher, a man of God. He had built a church with these hands. But he had also been a soldier. He had seen battle, had known the terrible calculus of kill or be killed. And as he looked down the long, iron sight of the rifle, he knew that the man he had been in the war was about to be resurrected. The rider drew closer, following their trail with an unnerving, predatory certainty. Nathaniel could make out his features now. A lean, weathered face, a long, dusty coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He watched as Cain reached the base of the cliff and dismounted, his eyes scanning the rock face, searching for their hiding place. For a moment, Cain's gaze passed right over the cave entrance, and Nathaniel allowed himself a flicker of hope. But Cain was too experienced, too patient. He tethered his horse and began to walk the base of the cliff, his eyes now moving with a slow, methodical precision. He was going to find them. It was only a matter of time. Nathaniel's finger tightened on the trigger. He had one advantage, the element of surprise. He could take the first shot, but as he centered the sight on Cain's chest, a terrible, paralyzing thought seized him. To fire this gun, to take a human life, would be to surrender the last, tattered remnant of the man he had once been. It would be to become the monster Silas Croft had always claimed he was. He looked back at Eleanor, who was watching him, her face pale, her violet eyes filled with a terrible, silent understanding. She knew what this moment was costing him. He turned back to the canyon. Cain was almost directly below them now, his head tilted back as he scanned the cliff face. Their eyes met. There was no recognition in Cain's gaze, just the cold, impersonal assessment of a hunter who had cornered his prey. He raised his Sharps rifle, the movement unhurried, almost casual. And in that frozen, terrible moment, Nathaniel Brooks knew that his choice had been made for him. To save Eleanor, to save himself, he would have to kill. The preacher would have to die, so the soldier could live. The glint of the Sharps rifle was a period at the end of a sentence Nathaniel had been running from his entire life. In that heart-stopping instant, as Jedediah Cain's cold eyes locked onto their hiding place, the theological debates of Boston, the shame of his exile, the very foundations of his faith, all collapsed into a single, brutal point of clarity. He was a man with a gun, and another man with a gun was about to kill the woman he was sworn to protect. The soldier in him, long dormant, took control. He didn't think, he reacted. As Cain lifted the Sharps to his shoulder, Nathaniel squeezed the trigger of the old Springfield. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the report of the single shot echoing across the canyon like a crack of doom. He saw a puff of dust explode from the rock face a foot to Kane's left. A miss, a warning. Kane, startled by the shot from an unexpected quarter, dove for the cover of a nearby boulder. His movements economical and swift. He was a professional, unrattled by the surprise. The hunter had become the hunted, but the fight was far from over. "Stay down!" Nathaniel yelled at Eleanor, pulling back from the cave entrance as a high-powered slug from the sharps slammed into the rock where his head had been moments before, showering the cave with stone fragments. The sound was a deafening roar, a testament to the rifle's terrifying power. He scrambled to a new position, his mind racing. He had 9 shots left. Kane had a repeating rifle and, presumably, plenty of ammunition. The high ground was their only advantage, but Kane was patient. He would pin them down, wait for them to make a mistake. "The mule!" Eleanor's voice was a sharp cry from the back of the cave. "Patience!" Nathaniel risked a quick glance. The mule, spooked by the gunfire, had broken free from its tether and was now stumbling out onto the narrow ledge. It was a perfect, exposed target. Before Nathaniel could shout a warning, another shot from the sharps rang out. The mule screamed, a high, terrible sound of animal pain, and staggered, a dark stain spreading across its flank. It teetered on the edge of the ledge for a long, agonizing moment. Then its legs gave way, and it tumbled into the canyon, taking most of their precious water and food with it. The loss was catastrophic. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through Nathaniel's adrenaline-fueled focus. They were trapped, their supplies gone, their escape route cut off. He risked another look over the edge. Kane had moved, using the mule's fall as a distraction. He was now working his way up a narrow, almost invisible crevice in the rock face, a flanking maneuver that would bring him level with the cave in a matter of minutes. "He's climbing," Nathaniel said, his voice grim. "On the west side. He'll be on our level in less than 5 minutes." Eleanor dragged herself to his side, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate light. She looked down at her sprained ankle, then at the sheer drop into the canyon. There was no escape. "Give me the rifle," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Nathaniel stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "You can't be serious. You've never fired a gun in your life." "You don't know that," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "My father insisted all his children learn to shoot. He said it was a necessary skill for a certain class of people." She held out her hand. "You can't defend both sides of this cave at once. He'll trap us. Give me the rifle." He hesitated for only a second. She was right. Their only chance, however slim, was to divide Kane's attention. He handed her the heavy Springfield and his pouch of ammunition. 9 shots, he said. "Make them count." He pulled his father's old Colt revolver from his belt, a weapon he had never fired in anger. It felt heavy and clumsy in his hand compared to the familiar heft of a rifle. "He'll expect us to be watching the crevice," Nathaniel said, his mind working quickly. "You stay here. Cover that approach. I'm going to try to get above him." He pointed to a series of handholds on the back wall of the cave that led up to a small opening near the roof. It was a chimney, a natural fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. If he could get onto the cliff top, he might be able to get a clear shot at Kane as he emerged from the crevice. "Nathaniel, no," Eleanor protested, her eyes wide with fear. "It's too dangerous. He'll see you. It's our only chance," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He pressed her shoulder, a brief, firm touch of reassurance. "Just keep him busy." He began the difficult, treacherous climb up the chimney, his boots scraping for purchase on the rough stone, his back pressed against the opposite wall. The opening at the top was a small, bright circle of blue sky. As he climbed, he could hear the sporadic crack of the Springfield from the cave below, followed by the deafening roar of Kane's sharps. Eleanor was doing her job. She was buying him time. He reached the top, his muscles screaming with effort, and cautiously peered over the edge. He was on a wide, flat ledge above the cave, exposed to the sky. Below him, he could see Kane, now only a few yards from the top of the crevice. Eleanor's shots, fired from an unfamiliar weapon, had been wild, but they had forced Kane to move more slowly, more carefully. Nathaniel took aim with the Colt, the pistol feeling inadequate for the distance. He needed to be closer. He began to crawl across the ledge, trying to get directly above Kane's position. A loose pebble dislodged under his hand and skittered over the edge. It was enough. Kane looked up, his eyes immediately finding Nathaniel's exposed form. He was too far away for Kane to use the sharps effectively in the narrow crevice, but he drew a pistol from his belt with lightning speed. The two men fired at almost the same instant. A bullet whizzed past Nathaniel's ear, stinging his cheek with a spray of powdered rock. His own shot went wide, kicking up dust on the cliff face. Kane was out of the crevice now, scrambling onto a ledge just below Nathaniel's, his face a mask of cold fury. He was reloading his pistol, his movements quick and efficient. Nathaniel knew he had only seconds. He couldn't win a gunfight with this man. He had to do the unexpected. With a desperate, guttural cry, he launched himself off the ledge, dropping the 10 feet onto the narrow space where Kane stood. The two men collided with brutal force. The impact sent them both staggering toward the cliff edge. Kane's pistol flew from his hand, skittering over the rocks and into the abyss. Nathaniel lost his own grip on the Colt as he grappled with the bounty hunter. They were locked in a primal, desperate struggle, their bodies straining against each other on a narrow precipice 100 feet above the canyon floor. Kane was wiry and strong, his muscles like steel cables. He fought with a cold, vicious efficiency, his fists and elbows finding their mark. Nathaniel fought with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. He absorbed the blows, his mind focused on a single objective, to keep Kane from throwing him over the edge. They swayed back and forth, their boots slipping on the loose scree. The world narrowed to this tiny patch of rock, the wind whistling in their ears, the vast, empty space of the canyon yawning below. Kane managed to get a hand around Nathaniel's throat, his thumb pressing into his windpipe. Stars exploded behind Nathaniel's eyes. He clawed at Kane's hand, his lungs burning. As his vision began to tunnel, his flailing hand found a large, loose rock at the edge of the ledge. He gripped it, his fingers closing around the rough, heavy stone. With the last of his strength, he brought it up and slammed it into the side of Kane's head. There was a sickening, wet crunch. Kane's eyes went wide with surprise, the pressure on Nathaniel's throat slackening. The bounty hunter staggered back a step, his balance lost. He teetered on the edge for a long, impossible moment, his arms flailing for a purchase that wasn't there. Then, with a look of pure animal terror on his face, he fell backward into the void. His scream was cut short by the sickening thud of his body hitting the canyon floor far below. For a long moment, Nathaniel lay on the ledge, gasping for air, his body trembling with adrenaline and shock. He was alive. He had killed a man. He had become what he most feared. He pushed himself to his feet, his body a symphony of pain. He looked down at the still form in the canyon below, a broken doll cast aside. There was no triumph, no relief, only a profound and hollow emptiness. "Nathaniel!" Eleanor's voice, a thin, desperate cry from the cave, pulled him back from the edge. He made his way slowly, painfully, back to the crevice and began the difficult descent. He found her at the mouth of the cave, the Springfield lying on the ground beside her. She was staring at the body below, her face a pale, horrified mask. "It's over," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "He's gone." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of relief, horror, and something else he couldn't name. He saw the blood on his cheek, the bruises already forming on his face, the terrible, dead emptiness in his eyes. "You're hurt," she whispered. "I'm alive," he corrected, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He sank to the floor of the cave, the strength finally leaving his limbs. The soldier had done his job. Now, the preacher, or what was left of him, had to deal with the aftermath. Eleanor moved to his side, her own pain forgotten. She took the cloth he had used to bind her ankle and gently began to clean the gash on his cheek. Her touch was hesitant at first, then surer, more confident. It was the touch of a caregiver, a healer. They sat in silence for a long time as the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in hues of blood and fire. The desert, which had been their enemy, was now quiet, a silent, indifferent witness to the violence that had transpired. "What now?" Eleanor asked finally, her voice soft in the growing twilight. Nathaniel looked at her, at the woman for whom he had just taken a life. The daughter of his accuser, the catalyst for his final, terrible fall from grace. "Now," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had done, "we find a way to live with it." As darkness fell, a new kind of silence settled over them. It was not the silence of fear or animosity, but the quiet, shared solitude of two people who had passed through a crucible and emerged on the other side, irrevocably changed. They had survived. But Nathaniel knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the man who had climbed down from that ledge was not the same man who had climbed up. The preacher was dead, and in his place stood a killer,